Imagine standing on a hillside in upstate New York. Below you stretches a pristine lake, its waters so clear they reflect the surrounding mountains like polished glass. Behind you rises a limestone palace. 50 rooms, 22,000 square feet. Doric columns so massive they dwarf the men who built them. Ceilings that soar 18 feet high. Drawing rooms designed to host governors and senators. This is Hyde Hall, and in 1835, it was the largest private residence ever constructed in the United States since the Revolution. But here's what nobody tells you about Hyde Hall. This wasn't just another mansion built by another wealthy family. This was an empire. Over 120,000 acres of prime New York land. Sugar plantations in Jamaica. Political connections stretching from Albany to London. Wealth accumulated across 4 generations of colonial governors, land speculators, and aristocratic ambition. The Clarke family didn't just build a house. They built a dynasty designed to last forever. It didn't. Within 50 years of that palace's completion, the family fortune would be in ruins. The heir to over 40,000 acres would die bankrupt. The sheriff would auction the mansion from the courthouse steps, and the greatest American country house of its era would begin a century-long slide toward oblivion. This is the story of how it happened, not the abbreviated version you'll find in tourist brochures, not the sanitized tale of architectural preservation. This is the full account of ambition, miscalculation, and the brutal economics that destroyed one of America's forgotten great families. If you've ever wondered how generational wealth actually disappears, how fortunes that seem permanent can evaporate in a single generation, how the very strategies that build empires can destroy them, you need to hear this story through to the end. Let's begin where the Clarke dynasty truly started. Not in America, in England. In a modest village where a man named George Clarke was born in the early 17th century. He had no wealth, no connections, no land. He was nobody. His grandson would become acting governor of one of Britain's most valuable American colonies. His great-great-grandson would build the largest mansion on the continent, and his great-great-great-grandson would lose it all. The first George Clarke of consequence was born in 1676 in Swainswick, a small parish near Bath. Unlike his ancestors, he had education. He had ambition, and crucially, he had the right friends. In 1703, at age 27, he secured an appointment that would change his family's trajectory forever. He became Secretary of the Province of New York. This wasn't a minor posting. New York in 1703 was the linchpin of British colonial enterprise in North America. Its port controlled access to the Hudson River in the interior fur trade. Its position made it strategically vital for any conflict with the French in Canada. The Secretary of the Province was the second most powerful position in the colonial government. George Clarke had jumped from obscurity to the inner circle of colonial power in a single appointment. But the position offered something more valuable than prestige. It offered land. Colonial officials in early 18th century America had access to opportunities that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. Vast tracts of territory, larger than English counties, could be acquired for nominal fees. The Crown was eager to populate its American holdings. Officials who could organize patents and surveys could accumulate acreage that would have been impossible to obtain in land-starved Europe. George Clarke understood this immediately. Over the next 4 decades, he accumulated land with systematic precision. By 1715, he and his wife, Anne Hyde, had purchased an estate on Long Island that they named Hyde Park, after her family. But that was just the beginning. Through grants, purchases, and careful political maneuvering, Clarke assembled holdings that eventually exceeded 120,000 acres. That's 187 square miles, an area larger than many English counties. Spread across the Hudson Valley and central New York, it represented one of the largest private land holdings in colonial America. In 1736, the governor of New York died suddenly. George Clarke, as senior official, became acting governor. He would hold the position for 7 years, consolidating his power and expanding his holdings. He suppressed the conspiracy involving enslaved Africans and poor whites. He navigated the complex politics of colonial New York's competing factions. He enriched himself and his allies while maintaining the crown's favor. When Clarke returned to England in the 1740s, he was wealthy beyond anything his ancestors could have imagined. He purchased the ancestral estate of his wife's family in Cheshire, Hyde Hall, becoming lord of the manor. He had achieved the impossible. He had left England with nothing and returned a landed gentleman with estates on both sides of the Atlantic. But here's the complication that would echo through generations. George Clarke's children weren't content to stay in America. His eldest son returned to England. Other children maintained ties to Jamaica, where the family held sugar plantations worked by enslaved people. One son died on a military expedition. The American lands, the foundation of the family's wealth, sat largely undeveloped for decades. This geographic fragmentation would matter enormously. The Clarke fortune was spread across 3 continents. Managing it required coordination that 18th century communication couldn't support, and the American lands, the most valuable component, needed an heir willing to actually live there. That heir wouldn't arrive until 1806. His name was also George Clarke. Born in 1768, he was the great-grandson of the colonial governor. He had grown up in England, surrounded by wealth and privilege, but he was a younger son with limited inheritance. The English properties would go to his older brother. If George wanted wealth of his own, he would need to claim the American lands that had sat largely dormant for 2 generations. At 38 years old, George Clarke sailed for New York. What he found when he arrived wasn't a ready-made fortune. It was a legal nightmare. Tenants who had occupied Clarke lands for decades claimed ownership. Squatters had built farms on territory they considered abandoned. Local courts, skeptical of absentee English landlords, favored American settlers over aristocratic claimants. George Clarke spent 6 years fighting for his inheritance. The case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor in 1818. Jackson versus Clarke established his claim to the family lands, but the battle had cost him years and substantial funds, and it had taught him something important about America. Ownership meant nothing without presence. If the Clarke family wanted to maintain their American empire, they needed an American seat of power. They needed a palace. In 1813, while still fighting his legal battles, George Clarke made a strategic marriage. His bride was Anne Lowe Carey Cooper, a widow from one of New York's most prominent families. She was the former sister-in-law of James Fenimore Cooper, who would soon become America's most famous novelist. The marriage connected Clarke to the American aristocracy he was trying to join. It also gave him access to land adjacent to his own holdings on Otsego Lake. In 1817, with his legal battles finally won, Clarke began planning his masterpiece. He purchased additional land on the north shore of Otsego Lake. The site he chose offered a commanding view down the full length of the water. James Fenimore Cooper would later immortalize this lake as Glimmerglass in his Leatherstocking Tales. It was one of the most beautiful locations in New York State. For his architect, Clarke selected Philip Hooker of Albany. This was no arbitrary choice. Hooker was the preeminent architect in upstate New York, responsible for the original state capitol, Albany City Hall, and the facade of Hamilton College's chapel. He understood how to build monuments. He knew how to create structures that announced wealth and permanence. He was exactly what Clarke needed. The design they developed was unlike anything America had seen. Most wealthy Americans in this era built elegant farmhouses or adaptations of English Georgian architecture. Clarke wanted something grander. He wanted a palace that would rival the great country houses of England. He wanted to recreate the aristocratic life he had known in his youth, transplanted to the American wilderness. The construction would take 17 years. Think about that timeline for a moment. 17 years of continuous building. From 1817 to 1834. The workers who started as young men finished middle-aged. The original plans evolved and expanded across nearly 2 decades. Each phase of construction reflected the changing tastes and growing ambitions of its owner. The first phase, completed between 1817 and 1819, was the stone house. This was to be the family's private quarters, intimate rooms designed for daily living. Hooker employed a Palladian style with a central two-story core flanked by single-story wings. The porch featured Tuscan columns. A Palladian window crowned with an oval arch dominated the facade. 5 oval windows and restrained federal moldings gave the exterior a refined elegance. Inside, the rooms were comfortable rather than grand. A pair of library living rooms served as the heart of family life. 2 bedrooms provided private quarters. The walls were smooth ashlar limestone, carefully cut and fitted. Every detail reflected quality, but not ostentation. If construction had stopped there, Hyde Hall would have been a substantial country home. Impressive, but not extraordinary. Clarke had no intention of stopping. The second phase expanded dramatically. This wing would house the servants and services that any great estate required. Kitchens, storage rooms, a servants' dining hall occupied the ground floor. The second floor held bedrooms for staff. The exterior was plainer than the stone house, constructed of field stone rather than dressed ashlar. But the sheer size announced growing ambitions. The third phase was where Clarke's vision reached its full expression. The Great House, constructed between 1828 and 1834, adopted a neoclassical style distinct from the earlier Palladian work. Gone were the curved forms and ornate details. In their place rose a severe geometry of right angles. Massive Doric columns, among the earliest examples in New York, flanked the entrance. The limestone walls stretched 190 feet in length. Inside, the Great House contained 2 entertaining rooms that surpassed anything in private hands in America. The drawing room and dining room each measured 34 feet by 26 feet. Their ceilings soared 18 feet high, elaborately decorated with plasterwork. These were not rooms for family dinners. They were stages for performances of wealth and status, designed to host governors, senators, and visiting dignitaries. By the time construction finally ceased in 1834, Hyde Hall comprised nearly 50 rooms arranged around a central stone-paved courtyard. The complex measured 190 feet by 90 feet. Architectural historians would later call it possibly the largest domestic structure built in the United States between the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. It was, in the words of a 20th century critic, one of the 3 or 4 great buildings in America of its time. The cost is difficult to calculate in modern terms. Clarke spent decades on the project, using income from his tenant farms and the remnants of the family's Jamaican plantation profits. The labor alone, in an era before mechanized construction, represented thousands of man-hours. Every stone had to be quarried, shaped, and fitted by hand. Every piece of ornamental plasterwork required skilled craftsmen working for weeks. The furniture and decorations were imported from the finest sources in America and Europe. George Clarke created a monument. He built a physical embodiment of his family's rise from obscurity to aristocratic splendor. He constructed a house designed to anchor a dynasty for generations to come. He finished in 1834. He died in 1835. 1 year. George Clarke had exactly 1 year to enjoy his completed masterpiece. After 17 years of construction, after decades of legal battles, after a lifetime of planning, he had 12 months as master of the greatest private house in America. Then he was gone. What happens to an empire when its architect dies? What happens when the driving vision that created something extraordinary passes to someone who never shared that vision? This is where the Clarke story turns from triumph to tragedy. George Clarke left Hyde Hall and a share of his lands to his son, also named George Clarke. The younger George was an American. Born in 1822, just 5 years after construction began on Hyde Hall. He had grown up watching the palace rise around him, But he was a different kind of man than his father, where the elder George was calculating and patient, willing to spend decades on legal battles and construction. His son was restless and romantic. He painted. He played music. He gambled at fashionable resorts. He was, by all accounts, a dashing figure in his day, more suited to ballrooms than board meetings. But here's what George Clarke Jr. inherited when his father died: 42,000 acres of prime New York farmland. At a time when most Americans owned no land at all, he possessed territory larger than many European principalities. The tenant farmers working his lands paid rent that should have made him wealthy for life. By any reasonable measure, he was one of the richest men in New York State. The problem was agriculture. The 1840s and 1850s were boom years for American farmers. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, had opened New York to Western markets. Railroads were beginning to crisscross the countryside. The population was exploding, creating demand for food. Farmers who could get crops to market could make substantial profits. George Clarke Jr. watched his neighbors prosper. He watched tenant farmers working his own land earn money that could have been his. And he decided he wanted more than just rental income. He wanted to participate in the agricultural boom directly. His vehicle would be hops. Hops might seem like a peculiar focus for speculation, but in mid-19th century New York, hops were big business. The brewing industry was expanding rapidly, driven by German immigration and changing American tastes. Hops, essential for brewing beer, were in constant demand. Central New York's climate proved ideal for hop cultivation. By 1849, New York State had achieved national leadership in hop production. The economics looked irresistible. Hops prices were rising. Demand seemed unlimited. Land that George Clarke already owned could be converted to hop production with minimal investment. Instead of collecting modest rents from tenant farmers growing wheat and corn, he could grow hops himself and capture the full profit. He began speculating heavily in the hop market. He converted portions of his estate to hop cultivation. He borrowed against his lands to finance expansion. He bet the Clarke fortune on a single agricultural commodity. For a while, it worked. The hop market continued climbing. George Clarke Jr. saw paper profits that exceeded anything his rental income could have produced. He had found the secret to multiplying his inheritance. Then the market collapsed. Agricultural commodity markets in the 19th century were notoriously volatile. There was no crop insurance, no government price supports, no futures contracts to hedge against disaster. When prices fell, they fell hard. And when the hop market finally turned, George Clarke Jr. discovered that he had bet everything on the wrong hand. The exact timeline of his financial collapse isn't clear from surviving records. What is clear is the outcome. By the time George Clarke Jr. died in 1889, he was bankrupt. The man who had inherited 42,000 acres and one of America's great mansions left nothing but debts. The sheriff scheduled an auction to satisfy his creditors. Hyde Hall, the monument that took 17 years to build, would be sold from the courthouse steps. But this isn't where the story ends. In fact, this is where it takes its most unexpected turn. George Clarke Jr. had a son, also named George Hyde Clarke, born in 1858. This younger George had done what generations of Clarke men rarely managed. He had married well. His wife was Mary Gale Carter, whose family, the Averils and Carters of Cooperstown and Cleveland, possessed their own substantial fortune. When the sheriff announced the auction to settle George Clarke Jr.'s debts, Mary Gale Carter Clarke saw something her husband's family had perhaps forgotten how to see. She saw an opportunity. Through her family connections, Mary Gale arranged financing. When the auction took place, a buyer appeared ready to acquire Hyde Hall, nearly all its contents, and 3,000 surrounding acres. That buyer was George Hyde Clarke, financed by his mother-in-law. Think about what happened here. The Clarke family fortune, accumulated over nearly 200 years, had been destroyed by one generation of bad speculation. The estate, built by immigrants who became colonial governors, who survived the revolution, who won Supreme Court cases, who constructed the largest mansion in America, was lost to hop speculation. And it was saved by a daughter-in-law with cash and common sense. Mary Gail Carter Clarke didn't just rescue the physical estate. She saved the family's identity. She preserved the papers and records that documented 2.5 centuries of Clarke history. She maintained the house as a family home when economic logic suggested selling it off in pieces. Hyde Hall continued as a Clarke residence for 3 more generations after Mary Gail's intervention. Her husband George lived there until his death in 1914. Their son, another George Hyde Clarke born in 1889, became a gentleman farmer on the remaining estate. The family adapted to reduced circumstances. The days of imperial grandeur were over, but the mansion survived. The 20th century brought new challenges. The world wars drained wealth from old families. Changing economics made great estates increasingly difficult to maintain. The agricultural rents that had once supported aristocratic lifestyles couldn't cover modern costs. Tax burdens increased. Servant labor became expensive. Hyde Hall began to decay. The elaborate plasterwork in those 18-foot ceilings cracked and crumbled. Roofs leaked. Stone walls deteriorated. During World War II, when the house was closed for years, dry rot attacked the wooden structures. The costs of proper maintenance exceeded anything the Clarke family could afford. In 1955, Thomas Hyde Clarke inherited the estate. He was the last Clarke to hold Hyde Hall. He was born in 1936, exactly 119 years after his great-great-great-grandfather had begun construction. The world Thomas inherited bore no resemblance to the world that had created Hyde Hall. There was no more tenant farming, no more rental income from vast agricultural holdings, just an enormous, decaying mansion and the crushing burden of its upkeep. And then New York State arrived. In 1963, the state exercised eminent domain to acquire 600 acres around Hyde Hall for the development of Glimmerglass State Park. The Clarke family, after nearly a century and a half of ownership, lost their home not through bankruptcy or sale, but through government seizure. 144 years. From 1819, when the first wing was completed, to 1963, when the state took possession. 5 generations of Clarkes had called Hyde Hall home. Now it belonged to the public. But the state hadn't seized Hyde Hall because they wanted to preserve it. They wanted the land for a park. The enormous mansion was, from the state's perspective, a problem rather than an asset. It was expensive to maintain and didn't fit their recreational plans. Demolition became a real possibility. Here's where the story could have ended. Hyde Hall could have been torn down in the 1960s, its stones carted away for fill, its site graded for parking lots. One of America's greatest early houses could have simply disappeared, another victim of changing times and bureaucratic indifference. It didn't happen because a small group of people refused to let it happen. In 1964, the Friends of Hyde Hall Incorporated. Their mission was simple: save the house. They had no significant funding. They had no political power. They had nothing except determination and a conviction that some things deserve preservation, even when the economics don't make sense. The Friends began a campaign that would last decades. They raised money. They documented the house's historical and architectural significance. They lobbied politicians. They created public awareness of what Hyde Hall represented. They formed a partnership with New York State that kept the mansion standing while long-term solutions were developed. In 1986, their efforts paid off. Hyde Hall was designated a National Historic Landmark, recognized for its architecture and the completeness of its historical documentation. The threat of demolition finally passed. Today, Hyde Hall operates as a museum and cultural center. Visitors can tour the nearly 50 rooms. They can see the ongoing restoration work, the painstaking effort to stabilize and preserve what remains. They can stand on that hillside overlooking Otsego Lake and imagine what it felt like to be master of an empire. But what does Hyde Hall actually teach us? The obvious lesson is about the fragility of wealth. The Clarke family accumulated land and power across 2 centuries. They survived colonial politics, the American Revolution, the early republic's legal chaos, and the economic transformations of the 19th century. Then one generation of commodity speculation destroyed everything. 42,000 acres of prime farmland gone. The largest mansion in America sold at auction. A dynasty ended not by war or revolution, but by bad bets on hot prices. There's a deeper lesson, though. Look at who saved Hyde Hall and when. It wasn't saved by the men who built fortunes and empires. They were too busy speculating, gambling, pursuing schemes that would multiply their wealth. It was saved by Mary Gale Carter Clarke, a woman who saw value in preservation rather than speculation. It was saved by the friends of Hyde Hall, ordinary people who believed some things matter beyond their economic utility. The mansion that George Clarke spent 17 years building was preserved by people who understood something he perhaps never did: that monuments are only permanent if someone chooses to maintain them. That legacy requires stewardship, not just construction. That wealth created across generations can be destroyed in years, but the buildings and papers and memories can survive if someone decides they should. Hyde Hall stands today as evidence of both Clarke ambition and Clarke failure. The grand rooms where governors once dined now host tourists and school groups. The private quarters where a family lived for generations are museum exhibits. The agricultural empire that financed it all has shrunk to the grounds immediately surrounding the house. Is this failure or transformation? The Clarkes would probably be horrified to see their home open to paying visitors, their private papers preserved in university archives for scholars to analyze. They built Hyde Hall to establish a dynasty, to anchor a family in American soil for centuries to come. That dynasty is extinct in any meaningful sense, but the house survives. The documentation survives. The story survives. And perhaps that's a different kind of permanence than the Clarkes intended, but permanence nonetheless. Consider what was lost when other great American houses fell. The Clarke Mansion on Fifth Avenue, that a 121-room palace of a Montana copper king, was demolished in 1927. The Vanderbilt mansions that line New York's most fashionable avenue are almost all gone, replaced by commercial towers. The wealth that built the Gilded Age has largely dispersed, and the monuments that wealth created have mostly disappeared. Hyde Hall survived because it was built away from valuable real estate. Its location on a remote lake in upstate New York, a location that seemed perfect for a country estate in 1817, saved it from developers who would have replaced it with something more profitable. Its decay, which brought it to the edge of demolition, also protected it from the modifications that destroyed the historical integrity of houses that remained in private hands. Its capture by the state, which seemed like the final indignity, ultimately ensured its preservation. The story of Hyde Hall is a story about time. George Clarke, the colonial governor, accumulated land over 40 years. His great-grandson spent 17 years building a mansion. His great-great-grandson lost everything in a decade of speculation. The Friends of Hyde Hall have spent 60 years on restoration. Creation is slow, destruction is fast, preservation is endless. Standing in Hyde Hall's great drawing room today, looking up at those 18-foot ceilings with their elaborate plasterwork, you can almost feel the weight of those timelines. Every decorative element represents hours of skilled labor. Every stone in the walls was quarried, shaped, and fitted by workers whose names are lost to history. The aggregate effort that created this single building exceeds what any individual could accomplish in a lifetime, and it nearly vanished. Not through dramatic catastrophe, but through the gradual accumulation of neglect, financial pressure, and bureaucratic indifference. The greatest threats to heritage aren't fires or earthquakes. They're the slow erosion of resources and were required to maintain what previous generations built. The Clarks thought they were building for eternity. They thought land and stone and political connections would secure their family's position forever. They were wrong about the mechanisms of permanence, but they weren't entirely wrong about permanence itself. Hyde Hall endures, not as they intended, not as a family seat anchoring a landed dynasty, but it endures. Their name is still attached to it. Their story is still told within its walls. Visitors still stand where they stood, look out at the lake they loved, walk through rooms they designed for their own pleasure. Is that enough? Is that victory or failure? The answer probably depends on what you think permanence means. If permanence means your descendants living in your house forever, the Clarks failed absolutely. If permanence means being remembered, being documented, being preserved for future generations to learn from, they succeeded beyond what most families ever achieve. We know more about the Clarks than we know about most wealthy Americans of their era. Their papers, preserved through Mary Gale's intervention and the Friends' dedication, tell a story spanning 250 years. Their house, the physical embodiment of their aspirations, still stands. Their rise and fall offers lessons that remain relevant. How many families can say that? How many people who lived, worked, loved, and died in the 18th and 19th centuries left any trace at all? The Clarks, for all their failures, for all their lost lands and bankrupt speculations, left something permanent. Maybe that's the real lesson of Hyde Hall. Permanence isn't about dynasty or wealth or even buildings. It's about whether your story survives to be told. The Clarks built a monument that would outlast their fortune, their family, and their expectations. The monument became the message. And the message is this: what we build outlasts what we own. The mansion survives. The 42,000 acres are scattered among thousands of owners. The house stands, the family is gone. The story endures, the speculators are forgotten. George Clarke, standing on that hillside in 1817, looking out at the lake, dreaming of the palace he would build, couldn't have imagined how his story would end. He couldn't have predicted the hops speculation, the bankruptcy, the sheriff's auction, the state seizure, the near demolition. But he also couldn't have predicted the rescue, the preservation, the National Historic Landmark designation, the tourist walking through his rooms 2 centuries later. His monument survived, not the way he planned, not through the dynasty he hoped to establish, but it survived. And in the end, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than most of us will ever achieve. Maybe the forgotten Gilded Age palace, hidden away in upstate New York, overlooking the lake James Fenimore Cooper called Glimmerglass, teaches us something essential about what permanence actually means. Build something worth preserving. Make it beautiful enough that someone will fight to save it. Document your story so completely that future generations can learn from it. And hope that when your fortune fails, when your dynasty ends, when everything you planned falls apart, the monument you created will find its own champions. The Clarks couldn't save themselves, but they built something that others thought worth saving. In the end, that made all the difference. Hyde Hall still stands. The lake still glimmers below. The columns still rise toward the sky. And the story continues, told now not by Clarke descendants but by guides and historians and visitors who walk through rooms built for a dynasty that no longer exists. The empire is gone. The palace remains. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be. But there's more to this story. There are details that most accounts overlook. Threads that connect the Clarke saga to broader patterns in American history. Understanding these connections transforms Hyde Hall from a local curiosity into a window on the forces that shape the nation. Consider the labor that built Hyde Hall. We know Philip Hooker designed it. We know George Clarke financed it. But who actually lifted the stones? Who carved the ornate plasterwork? Who worked for 17 years to make one man's vision reality? The documentary record is frustratingly incomplete. Construction accounts survive in fragments. Workers' names appear occasionally in bills and receipts preserved in the Clarke family papers at Cornell University. But the full picture of who built Hyde Hall remains elusive. What we know suggests a workforce that reflected early 19th century America's complex labor arrangements. Skilled craftsmen, probably drawn from Albany and other regional centers, handled specialized work like the Doric columns and decorative plasterwork. Local farmers and laborers provided basic construction labor. The rhythm of building followed agricultural seasons, with intensive work during periods when farming demands were lighter. The irony is thick. George Clarke was building a monument to aristocratic pretension using labor from the democratic masses. The men who carved those columns and fitted those stones went home to modest farmhouses while creating a palace. They earned wages measured in shillings while their employer dreamed of dynasties. This wasn't unusual for the era. Every great house of the early republic was built by workers who would never be invited through its front door. But Hyde Hall's construction timeline makes the disparity especially stark. 17 years of labor. Workers who started as young men and finished middle-aged. Entire careers devoted to a single, wealthy family's vision. The economics of tenant farming that supported the Clarke Empire deserve examination too. George Clarke didn't work his 120,000 acres himself. He couldn't have. The land was scattered across multiple counties. Managing it directly would have been logistically impossible. Instead, the Clarkes operated as landlords. They leased parcels to tenant farmers who paid annual rents. The tenants did the actual work of clearing land, planting crops, raising livestock. The Clarkes collected payment for the privilege of working land they never touched. This arrangement was common in early New York. The great manorial families, the Van Rensselaers and Livingstons and Schuylers, operated similar systems. They held vast tracts acquired through colonial grants and leased them to working farmers. The system created wealth for the landlords while leaving tenants in a kind of permanent peasantry, working land they could never own. Tensions between landlords and tenants simmered throughout the early 19th century. The anti-rent wars of the 1840s saw tenant farmers across upstate New York resist the manorial system. They disguised themselves as Native Americans and attacked rent collectors. They held mass meetings demanding reform. The movement eventually succeeded in limiting the great landlord's power and opening opportunities for tenant purchase. The Clarkes weren't central targets of the anti-rent movement, but they operated within the same system that provoked it. Their wealth derived from arrangements that many Americans considered fundamentally unjust. The democracy celebrated in 4th of July speeches coexisted with quasi-feudal land tenure that kept working families subservient to hereditary landlords. George Clarke himself had faced legal challenges to his land claims. The Supreme Court case that established his ownership in 1818 was brought by tenants who claimed adverse possession of land the Clarkes had neglected for generations. The Clarkes won, but the challenge revealed how tenuous aristocratic claims could be in democratic America. When George Clarke Jr. lost the family fortune to hop speculation, he was in some sense a victim of the same economic forces that had threatened his father. He tried to extract more value from his land than traditional tenant farming provided. He gambled on market agriculture instead of steady rental income. The gamble failed, but the impulse behind it, the desire to maximize returns from landed wealth, was characteristic of his era. The Clarke family's connections to slavery also deserve acknowledgement. The original fortune that George Clarke, the colonial governor, accumulated came partly from Jamaica. The family held sugar plantations there, worked by enslaved Africans. The profits from human bondage helped finance the land acquisitions in New York that eventually supported Hyde Hall. This wasn't hidden or shameful in the Clarkes era. Sugar profits funded much of the English aristocracy. The colonial system depended on unfree labor in the Caribbean. George Clarke accumulated his wealth through means that his contemporaries considered entirely legitimate, even praiseworthy. The transformation of that blood-stained capital into the refined elegance of Hyde Hall represents something important about how wealth gets laundered through generations. By the time George Clarke built his mansion, the direct connection to slavery was 2 generations old. The money had been invested and reinvested, filtered through land purchases and tenant rents and legal fees. The violence at its origins was invisible in the gracious rooms overlooking Otsego Lake, but it was there. The columns that George Clarke admired from his drawing room were paid for, ultimately, by human beings who lived and died in bondage on Caribbean sugar plantations. The Doric portico was built on a foundation of exploitation that no architectural elegance could entirely disguise. This doesn't make the Clarkes uniquely guilty. Nearly every great fortune of the colonial and early national era has similar origins. The wealth that built Harvard and Yale, that funded founding fathers' plantations, that established banking houses and shipping firms, was entangled with slavery and colonial exploitation. The clean separation between respectable wealth and disreputable origins is a fiction. The mansions of Newport and the townhouses of Boston and the country estates of the Hudson Valley all rest on foundations that include human suffering. What makes the Clarke story particularly instructive is how visible those connections remain. The Jamaica plantations are documented in family papers. The transition from sugar profits to tenant rents to mansion construction can be traced across generations. Hyde Hall doesn't let us forget where wealth came from, even when we'd prefer not to remember. The relationship between James Fenimore Cooper and the Clarke family adds another layer to this story. Cooper married into the family that owned much of the land around Otsego Lake. His father, Judge William Cooper, founded Cooperstown and controlled vast tracts. The younger Cooper grew up surrounded by the tensions between landed proprietors and working settlers that would define his novels. When George Clarke married Anne Lowe Carey Cooper, he was joining the same aristocratic network that Cooper knew intimately. The world Cooper portrayed in his Leatherstocking Tales, that romantic vision of frontier wilderness giving way to civilization, was the world the Clarkes inhabited. They were the civilizers, the builders of great houses, the proprietors who imposed order on wilderness. But Cooper understood something about that world that perhaps the Clarkes didn't. He understood it was temporary. His novels are elegies for a way of life already disappearing as he wrote. The frontier aristocrats who populate his books are always on the edge of obsolescence. The wilderness they claim to civilize is already transforming into something they can't control. Cooper died in 1851. He lived long enough to see the Erie Canal transform New York's economy. He saw railroads beginning to crisscross the state. He witnessed the early tensions of the anti-rent wars. He knew the world that had produced his family's wealth was changing in ways that couldn't be reversed. George Clarke Jr., gambling on hops in the 1860s and 1870s, was trying to adapt to the world Cooper had understood was coming. The stable rents from tenant farmers weren't enough in an era of market agriculture and industrial wealth. The old aristocratic model, where land ownership alone guaranteed prosperity, was failing. Clarke needed to become a modern businessman, a speculator, an entrepreneur. He failed at the transition, but the fact that he tried reveals something important about why so many old American fortunes disappeared. The strategies that built wealth in one era often destroy it in the next. George Clarke, the colonial governor, succeeded by understanding how to manipulate land grants and political appointments. His great-grandson succeeded by understanding how to impose aristocratic presence on democratic America. His great-great-grandson failed because he tried to become a modern capitalist without understanding the risks that came with it. Picture George Clarke Jr. in the 1870s, standing in Hyde Hall's great drawing room, looking at account books that showed mounting debts. The mansion around him represented everything his family had achieved. 50 rooms filled with imported furniture, walls hung with family portraits, libraries stocked with leather-bound volumes. Every surface announced permanence, stability, dynastic continuity. But the numbers told a different story. The hops market had collapsed. The loans he'd taken against his land were coming due. The tenant farmers who had reliably paid rent for decades were struggling themselves, caught in the same agricultural depression that had destroyed his speculation. The gap between the mansion's promise of eternal prosperity and the reality of modern economics was widening into an abyss. What do you do when you're the heir to an empire, but the empire is bankrupt? When your name opens doors, but your credit is exhausted? When the house you inherited is too large to sell and too expensive to maintain? George Clarke Jr. had no good options. He couldn't sell Hyde Hall. Who would buy an enormous mansion in rural New York? He couldn't abandon it. It was the physical embodiment of his family's identity. He couldn't maintain it. He was effectively broke. So he did what many men in his position did. He held on. He mortgaged what remained. He hoped something would change. He died in 1889, still hoping, leaving his son to face the consequences. The sheriff's auction that followed wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a symbol of a broader transformation in American society. The auction represented the end of the landed aristocracy that had dominated early America. The tenant farming system that had enriched the Clarks and families like them was obsolete. The great estates assembled through colonial land grants were being broken up and sold to working farmers who could actually make the land productive. When Mary Gail Carter Clarke arranged the financing to buy Hyde Hall at auction, she wasn't just saving a house. She was making a statement about what wealth meant in modern America. The old wealth, based on land and rents and inherited position, had failed. The new wealth, based on industry and commerce and active investment, could save what the old wealth had built but couldn't maintain. Mary Gail came from a family that understood the new rules. The Carters and Averils had made their money in business, not tenant farming. They invested actively rather than collecting passive rents. They understood that wealth in industrial America required constant management and adaptation. The strategies that had preserved the Clarke fortune for 6 generations were obsolete. Mary Gail represented a different approach. And it worked, at least temporarily. Her intervention gave Hyde Hall another 70 years of family ownership. Her son and grandson lived there, adapted the estate to 20th century realities, maintained the house even as its original purpose disappeared. They weren't lords of a landed empire. They were gentlemen farmers, anachronisms who preserved a lifestyle that economics no longer supported. The question that haunts Hyde Hall is whether any of it was sustainable. Could the Clarks have held on to their empire if George Clarke Jr. hadn't speculated on hops? Could any system of hereditary land ownership survive in democratic, capitalist America? The answer, suggested by the fate of every other great manorial estate in New York, is probably no. The Van Rensselaer holdings, far larger than the Clarks, were broken up by the anti-rent wars and economic pressure. The Livingston estates were sold off piece by piece. The great Hudson Valley manors that seemed permanent in 1800 were mostly gone by 1900. The Clarks held on longer than most, but only because they were willing to accept reduced circumstances and because Mary Gail's money bought time. The eminent domain seizure in 1963 was in some ways a mercy. Thomas Hyde Clarke, the last family owner, couldn't have maintained Hyde Hall much longer. The costs were overwhelming. The tourist industry that now supports the house didn't exist yet. Without state intervention, Hyde Hall would likely have decayed until it collapsed, another great American house lost to time and weather. Instead, the state seizure forced a solution. It created the crisis that mobilized the friends of Hyde Hall. It made preservation a public concern rather than a private burden. The loss of family ownership, painful as it was, ultimately saved the house. Walk through Hyde Hall today and you'll see the layers of this history. The elegant stone house, built first, reflects George Clarke's original modest ambitions. The service wing shows the expansion of those ambitions. The great house, with its massive Doric columns and 18-foot ceilings, reveals the full flowering of aristocratic pretension. The peeling paint and cracked plaster document the 20th century decline. The careful restoration work shows the 21st century commitment to preservation. every layer tells part of the story. The house is a physical record of American ambition, American hubris, American failure, and American determination to preserve what's valuable even when it's no longer profitable. The guides who lead tours through Hyde Hall emphasize different aspects of the story depending on their interests. Architectural historians focus on Philip Hooker's design innovations, the way he adapted English country house traditions to American materials and conditions. Social historians talk about the tenant farming system and the economic arrangements that supported aristocratic lifestyles. Preservationists discuss the challenges of maintaining a building this size with limited resources. But the story that matters most is the human one. The story of people who dreamed of permanence and built monuments to those dreams. The story of those dreams colliding with economic reality. The story of how what we build can outlast our intentions, can survive our failures, can become something we never planned. George Clarke didn't build Hyde Hall to be a museum. He built it to be the seat of a dynasty that would endure for centuries. He built it to announce that the Clarke family had arrived at the pinnacle of American society and would remain there permanently. He built it as a statement that some things, some families, some fortunes are too grand to fail. He was wrong, but his wrongness produced something valuable. It produced a building that shows us exactly how empires fall, how wealth accumulates and dissipates, how ambition outstrips resources, how the monuments we build can become evidence against our pretensions. There's a room in Hyde Hall, a small bedroom on the second floor that doesn't appear in most tourist accounts. It's cramped and plain, with low ceilings and simple finishes. It was servants' quarters, housing for the people who actually made the mansion function. The contrast with the grand entertaining rooms downstairs is stark. Stand in that servants' room and look out the window. You can see the same view of Otsego Lake that George Clarke enjoyed from his drawing room. The water is just as beautiful from the servants' quarters as from the master's chambers. The mountains frame the lake identically. The sunset paints the same colors across the sky. The view was always democratic. The house tried to impose hierarchy, to separate masters from servants, aristocrats from workers, owners from tenants. But the landscape didn't cooperate. The beauty that George Clarke claimed as his exclusive possession was available to anyone who looked out a window. Maybe that's the most subversive truth Hyde Hall reveals. The things we try hardest to monopolize, the pleasures we think our wealth entitles us to exclusively, are often the things that can't actually be monopolized. The view is free. The sunset doesn't respect property lines. The lake reflected the same stars for tenant farmers as for landlords. George Clarke spent 17 years and a fortune creating barriers, distinctions, hierarchies. He built a house that screamed, "I am separate from and superior to everyone else." And he succeeded, at least temporarily. The barriers were real. The distinctions mattered. The hierarchies shaped lives. But they couldn't be sustained. The economic forces that made tenant farming profitable eventually made it obsolete. The social structures that supported aristocratic pretension eventually crumbled under democratic pressure. The house that announced Clarke's superiority eventually opened its doors to anyone with the price of admission. The democratization of Hyde Hall wasn't what George Clarke intended, but it might be the most valuable thing his monument achieved. By failing as a dynasty, by losing the fortune, by ending up in public hands, Hyde Hall became something more useful than a private mansion. It became a teaching tool. It became evidence. It became a story that anyone can access and learn from. The final irony is that Hyde Hall is probably more visited now, more appreciated, more carefully maintained than it ever was as a private residence. The Friends of Hyde Hall have done more to preserve the building than the Clarke family ever did. The tourists who walk through its rooms engage with its history more thoughtfully than most of the family members who live there. The public ownership that seemed like humiliation has proved to be salvation. This is what happens to monuments when they outlive their maker's intentions. They find new meanings, new purposes, new constituencies. They become public property in every sense. even when legal ownership is unclear. They teach lessons their builders never intended, reveal truths their owners tried to hide, survive for reasons their creators couldn't have imagined. George Clarke's ghost, if it walks anywhere, walks the halls of a house filled with strangers. It watches tourists photograph the drawing room. It listens to guides explain the family's failures. It observes preservationists working to save what the family couldn't maintain. And perhaps that ghost has learned something the living George Clarke never understood. That the only way anything truly lasts is if it becomes bigger than its original purpose. If it transcends its builder's intentions. If it finds champions and people who have no stake in its original meaning. The story of Hyde Hall is ultimately a story about what endures and why. It's not a story about success in any conventional sense. The family failed, the fortune disappeared, the dynasty ended. The house nearly collapsed. Every goal George Clarke had when he broke ground in 1817 was ultimately frustrated, and yet something remains, something valuable, something worth preserving and studying and sharing. The failure itself became the message. The ruins became the monument. The ending became the story worth telling. How many successful dynasties do we remember? How many families that held on to their fortunes and their houses and their positions for generations command our attention now? They're boring. They're irrelevant. They have nothing to teach us except that some people are lucky and rich and manage to stay that way. But failure, instructive failure, the kind where you can trace exactly how ambition became hubris and hubris became bankruptcy, where you can walk through the physical evidence of dreams that exceeded reality. That's valuable. That's educational. That's worth preserving. Hyde Hall is worth more as a lesson than it ever was as a residence. The millions of dollars that have been spent on its preservation are justified not by nostalgia for aristocratic lifestyles, but by the value of understanding how those lifestyles actually worked and why they failed. The house is a laboratory for studying wealth, power, ambition, and their limitations. And it's beautiful. That matters too. George Clarke might have been wrong about everything else, but he was right about beauty. He chose a spectacular site. He hired a talented architect. He created spaces that still take your breath away 200 years later. The 18-foot ceilings in the drawing room are genuinely impressive. The view from the hilltop is genuinely stunning. The proportions and details reflect genuine taste and refinement. The beauty outlasted the purpose. The aesthetic achievement survived the economic failure. And that's worth something. In a world that increasingly values only utility and profit, Hyde Hall stands as evidence that human beings are capable of creating things that don't make economic sense, but make every other kind of sense. We need beauty. We need monuments. We need physical evidence that previous generations dreamed of something beyond mere survival. Even failed dreams, maybe especially failed dreams, serve that purpose. They show us that our ancestors reached beyond their grasp, that they tried to build things that would outlast them, that they cared about legacy and permanence in beauty, even when they were wrong about how to achieve those things. Stand on the hillside above Hyde Hall as the sun sets over Otsego Lake. The mansion rises behind you, its limestone walls golden in the fading light. Below, the lake mirrors the sky, reflecting clouds and mountains in water so still it seems like glass. Around you, the forest that has reclaimed what were once cultivated fields whispers in the evening breeze. This is what George Clarke saw when he chose this spot. This is the view that convinced him to spend 17 years building a palace. This is the landscape that seemed to promise eternal prosperity, permanent grandeur, a dynasty that would endure as long as the mountains and the lake. He was wrong about the dynasty. He was wrong about permanence. He was wrong about almost everything except the beauty of this particular piece of earth and the value of trying to create something worthy of it. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. It's enough to justify the preservation efforts. It's enough to make the story worth telling. It's enough to turn failure into a kind of success that might be more valuable than conventional triumph. The forgotten Gilded Age palace isn't forgotten anymore. The empire is gone, but the story survives. The fortune disappeared, but the monument endures. And every visitor who walks through those 50 rooms, who stands in that drawing room looking up at the 18-foot ceilings, who steps outside to view the lake, becomes part of a chain of witnesses that stretches back to 1817 and forward to however long Hyde Hall continues to stand. That chain of witnesses is the real permanence George Clarke achieved, not through his family, not through his fortune, but through the building he created and the story it tells. As long as Hyde Hall stands, as long as people visit and guides explain and historians study, the Clarke dynasty lives in a way its founder never anticipated. The lesson is this: what we build can become greater than we are. Our failures can teach more than our successes. The monuments we create can find purposes we never intended. And if we're very lucky, if we build beautifully enough and fail instructively enough, our stories will outlast our names. Hyde Hall is that story, the forgotten palace that refused to be forgotten, the failed dynasty that succeeded at something more important than wealth, the monument that outlasted the empire it was built to celebrate. The lake still glimmers, the columns still stand, the rooms still echo with footsteps. And the story continues, told now by strangers to strangers, a tale of ambition and failure and survival that belongs not to the Clarkes anymore but to anyone who cares to listen. That might be the greatest achievement of all.